Alright, so if you can hear stuff in the background, that's my dryer running. So I've been reading this book called Sexy But Psycho, and it's an examination of how patriarchy has been pathologizing young girls and women, and especially those who have been victim to abuse. Now, I want to read you this passage from the foreword. I haven't even started the book yet. I'm on the foreword, okay? That's the section that I've completed of this book. I'm going to read you a passage from her 2009 experiences. I'm not even going to read all of the experiences that she outlines in this foreword, but I'm going to read you something from 2009, and drop a comments. Drop a comment down below this video if this sounds familiar to you. It was a sunny early morning on the day 2 police officers knocked at my front door. They'd woken me up with a phone call 30 minutes earlier to tell me they were coming over and needed to speak to me. I had been waiting months for this day. The day we finally got the court date for the trial of the man who had raped, abused, and terrified me for 5 years. So this is Dr. Jessica Taylor's story. As a teenager, I had become pregnant by him twice. The first time had resulted in a miscarriage after he pushed me down a flight of stairs. The second time, only a couple of months later, resulted in me having a baby when I was 17 years old. The case had been horrendous and I had been ignored for months at a time. Every time now, I want you guys to note me and make a note in the comments if this sounds familiar to you, okay? This is Dr. Taylor's experiences. Every time I tried to get in touch with my police officer, he told me that they were just waiting for the trial date to be set. I found out later that he had written on my notes that I was a tattletale. How many TIs, and especially female TIs, had been subject to the most unprofessional behavior and the biggest lies when it came to handling our case? Now, this happens with all TIs, but I want women TIs in particular to note in the comment section how many times they've been brushed off when it comes to serious crimes committed against them. So Dr. Jessica Taylor, this woman, right, at the age of 17, having done the right thing, like everybody else tells her to do, oh, why don't you report it? This woman reported it. And she was met with disdain, disrespect, and she was palmed off, brushed off repeatedly. It gets worse. I had been waiting for 14 months for a trial date, and I was often treated like a nuisance by the officers in the case. Once again, I can relate. It's on a much lesser scale than this woman here, but I've had my home broken into. I've been reactively abused, not even just in this place, but in other places that I've been in. I've had all that stuff happen to me. Reported it to the police like I was supposed to, and the police did nothing. So they want you to sit there and do nothing while these people harass and brutalize you. And yet at the same time, the police ain't about to do shit either. This is what they do, okay? So Jessica had been waiting 14 months for a trial at this point. And she was 18 by the time this happened. So 14 months went past. She turned 18 at that time. I had been waiting for 14 months for a trial date, and I was often treated like a nuisance by the officers in the case. Throughout those long and frightening months of waiting, I had been stalked. Again, note in the comments with this when this sounds familiar. I had been stalked, harassed, threatened, beaten up. I haven't been beaten up. I haven't been beaten up, touch wood. Touch wood, it won't happen. My social media had been hacked again, same. And I lived in fear of my life every single day. Again, TIs, I want you to note in the comments when this starts sounding familiar. Dr. Jessica Taylor had been stalked, harassed, threatened, beaten up, her social media had been hacked, and she had been intimidated every single day of her life, even after making the report, okay? She's doing the right thing. She's reporting it to the authorities. And I want you to listen carefully to how they respond. I moved 40 miles away from where I grew up in an effort to stay safe and undetected. I had a 1-year-old child from the rapist, and I was trying to protect my child with everything I had as an 18-year-old woman, which wasn't much more than sheer determination. The police officer in my case was stood at the door with a woman I had never seen before. Listen to this. I assumed it was good news and we were finally going to trial. They sat on the little faux leather two-seater and the male officer quickly said what he had come to say. Again, my fellow TIs, stop this if it becomes... Not stop me, but comment in the comment section below when this sounds familiar, okay? The case had been dropped. The bail conditions had been dropped. Now, it gets even more disgusting than that. Hold tight. So, the officers, one of them being a woman, and I think it was the woman that did this, she reached in her bag and pulled out a leaflet on mental health disorders and medication. The woman who attended that particular meeting in the 18-year-old's flat with the police officer told the 18-year-old that there is a possibility she might have been mentally ill and needed medication. Now, I want to run through what has been done to this woman. Okay? First of all, this woman was clearly groomed at a young age by a violent rapist, okay? Clearly this woman was groomed. She was beaten up. She was abused. And throughout the time that he'd been abusing her, he'd been doing it for 5 years. So think of this, right? If he'd been doing it for 5 years, that means he'd been doing it since she was, what? About 12 years old? I could be wrong. I don't want to make libelous statements. But she said that this man had impregnated her twice. And he had raped, abused, and terrified her for 5 years. That means he'd been doing that since she was a fucking child. Not only that, among the injuries that she sustained from this man, she sustained a dislocated shoulder and a torn neck. And even at that time, in one of those incidents where she sustained those injuries, she was protecting her baby at the same time. That's second. Third, even after she called the police, she was still stalked, threatened, and harassed anyway. And beaten up. So after all that happened to her, they had the nerve to turn around to this woman and blame her mental health issues. Now, if you look back through my videos, I've had evidence of harassment. I've had evidence of corruption from Burnt Mind, from my local councils, both here in Brighton and back in London. I've had proof and evidence of people trying to set me up, people engaging in reactive abuse and then calling the police on me and telling lies, which contradicted the evidence. You've also heard audio evidence of police officers with me saying, I've got evidence if you want to look at it, and the police haven't looked at the evidence. This is the type of fucking shit that they do. My case wasn't even as bad as this. Like, with me, it was always mental. It was always like I got electronically tortured. And it, you know, for the most part, it was electronic torture, and it was harassment, sexual harassment or neighborhood harassment. It was harassment usually, and electronic torture. This woman was beaten and raped from the time she was a fucking child. And they still pathologized her. Let me continue reading Jessica's story now. They explained, the police officer and this fucking dingbat from psychiatry, they explained to this 18-year-old abuse victim and grooming victim that she had become obsessed with the trial and the case, that she was ringing the police too often. Again, I was accused of the same thing when I was being harassed, that I was ringing people too often, right? And that I was doing this, that, and the third too often, right? And, you know, she was getting death threats as well. So she was calling the police too much, telling the authorities too much. I got accused of the same thing. And this woman and this police officer had apparently met the perpetrator every month, and he seemed like a good guy. So to recap, this young woman, this young girl, had been putting up with abuse almost daily from this piece of shit. And from their once a month meetings, they, in their infinite wisdom, they decide that he's a lovely man and he hasn't done anything wrong, and she's the crazy one. Again, link it in the, you're not link it, but comment in the comment section if this sounds motherfucking familiar, because it should do. So they basically, and this is another thing that they did, ignoring evidence. Let me prove it to you. This is what Jessica says in her book. I told them that I had kept all the 47 text messages detailing the death threats, and that I had managed to record some voicemails he had left me. I told them about the men he had sent to my house to attack me, and the way I had hidden under the table with my baby when they came banging on all of the windows and doors to get in. Listen to what they do next. They suggested that maybe those things didn't happen and that I needed help. They wouldn't look at the text messages or listen to the voicemails. So you clearly have a traumatized young woman who's been basically ravaged by abuse, holding on by a thread while she looks after a 1-year-old child. Very young woman. And she is told by people who are supposed to be protecting her and looking after her interests that she's mentally ill and that none of it happened. Now, it's to my mind that this is being done to scores of people in this country that are seen as undesirables, okay? It's to my mind that they're being done to plenty of people within marginalized communities, poor, black, even brown, you know, Romani travelers, Irish travelers, you know, anybody who is in the fringes of society are more likely to be subjected to this kind of treatment than anyone else, and especially women. So I don't want to discount this woman's experiences, but it seems to me like that's a TI experience, most definitely. But instead of simply reducing it to this is a TI experience, it really gets me thinking, because in our own lives, in the lives of TIs, we get a microcosm of the prison industrial complex and the psychiatric industrial complex, the prison pipeline and the hospital pipeline. We see those things in action, okay? Now, because of the dichotomies between masculinity and femininity, it's not that women can't be imprisoned and men can't be hospitalized. That's not what this is, right? But men who don't fit the societal standard are more likely to be treated as terrorists or treated as violent, whereas the women who don't fit into society are more likely to be treated as crazy. Really put together, first of all, how far the abuse goes all the way up to the top of the pyramid. Then I want you to consider the culture that comes from the top. As soon as we hear somebody's been raped, abused, or trafficked, those who choose to believe the victims are often labeled as being naive or not wanting to ask questions, or not wanting to prove someone innocent, like innocent until proven guilty. That always comes up. What were you wearing? What were you doing? So instead of actually doing something about the perpetration, the victims are blamed for it. The reason for this is because our society is inherently abusive, and it relies on gaslighting, violence, intimidation, and dehumanization in order to keep it functioning, and in order to keep people in line, and in order to keep people divided. Now, to my mind, it sounds like Dr. Jessica Taylor is a targeted individual, or was a targeted individual. It's not uncommon for people who are, abused or groomed or trafficked at a young age to become TIs in order for them to be discredited. At the same time, the fact that she has experienced other women and girls frequently going through the same thing, where their mental health is called into question every time they report abuse, that to me brings up a wider implication of the psychiatric and prison pipelines that I was talking about earlier. It seems to me that the reason why abuse victims are immediately discredited and treated as mentally ill, or treated as deranged, especially if said victims are not entirely helpless. The reason why that happens, for me, to my mind, is pharmaceuticals. It's easier to maintain a society or gain profit when human beings are sick and in need, right? So instead of actually treating the problem of abuse of young people, not even just young women, of young people, instead of treating the abuse of children, treating the abuse of people on the fringes, instead of actually working to bring justice to all those people who have been abused, because that would involve too much paperwork, it would involve too much social change, societal change, and economic change. What they do instead is they take abuse victims, especially women, pathologize them so that they can give them some fucking pills to administer. I used to hear this talking point from people on the outskirts all the time, and I just used to think that, you're just throwing out the baby with the bathwater, because talking therapies really help, cognitive behavioral therapies really help, but how much do they really help if they are weaponized against victims of abuse, to the point where you're telling abuse victims that what they experienced is not real? You were not there, you did not experience it. You don't even have a scan to determine what mental illnesses the abuse victim has, and yet you're sitting there telling them that they made it up, or they're imagining it, or they're deluded. Once again, I've been through this. I've been through all of this. I am a 37-year-old woman who hasn't even been through nearly as much as this 18-year-old girl has been through. Imagine having the baby from the person who violated you, trying to keep that child safe, doing all the right things, reporting it, making sure that her voice is heard. And again, I can't judge what victims decide to do about their abuse, but all the talking points that we usually talk about, oh, why didn't they report it? She fucking reported it, and look what happened there. And this woman went on to witness other abuse victims and other grooming victims having the same things done to them. They're being accused of being mentally ill. It's a joke. And it's not fucking funny. this TI problem, I don't know if, I don't even know if it's a TI problem anymore. This is wider than I thought it was. I knew that people on the fringes or people who were deemed as second-class citizens were going through it, but I didn't understand just how bad the fucking shit was. Like, I didn't know. And I'd been hearing from other targeted individuals that have been, that have been assaulted or AR'd multiple times. I've been hearing from people who have been trafficked and stuff, and like the wildest shit. And nothing even prepared me for how widespread this shit was and how much profit was being put ahead of people's welfare. It's one thing for me to go through it because I've been taught all my life through repeated humiliation and repeated disrespect. I've been taught to invalidate my own abuse and invalidate my own experiences. So it's one thing for it to happen to me because there's always a back in my mind thinking, even though I know it's real, in the back of my mind, sometimes I still question myself, and it's a fight for me not to do that. But it's watching when other people go through the same things I am, except even worse. That's what makes me realize, you know what? This shit is more widespread than I think it is. And this shit is just more evil than I ever thought it was. Shout out to Dr. Jessica Taylor. I haven't read your entire book yet, but I will continue to read your book. And there's something sinister about this. It just feels like, on a very small underground level, there are young people being groomed and children being groomed, but especially young girls, like on a smaller scale. But on a bigger scale, it feels like the trauma responses to abuse, which are now getting too big to hide, because remember we've got energetic warfare as well happening. I'm not going to be too specific on that, but we've got energetic warfare from frequencies that harm the body and harm the emotions. So we've got energetic warfare, and then on top of that, the abuse that we go through, or when our symptoms are getting too big to hide, that is exploited in order to reinforce the same destructive patterns and the same destructive cycles that got us here. And the sinister part is that, think of all the children that have been abused. Think of all the women that have been abused. Think of all the men that have been abused. Think of all the marginalized groups that have been subjected to all kinds of fuckery. Their pain has been exploited to sell things, and in particular, drugs and arms. So the pain of child abuse victims, the pain of, people who have been abused and people who have been wronged, and the more marginalized you are, the less likely you are to be listened to. All the pain that you're going through has been taken and exploited in order to ultimately sell conventional drugs. Because why else would you be labeled mentally ill for reporting fucking abuse? Why else would you do that? It saves paperwork for the police. It saves paperwork for law enforcement. And it makes pharmaceuticals money, which means everybody else has made money as well. It's as simple as that. Now, you can call it oversimplifying, but based on what I'm seeing at that book, I ain't even touched the surface yet. I haven't even touched the surface yet. People are deliberately being kept sick. Their abuse is being exploited just to be able to sell fucking drugs. Like, you could not make this shit up. And remember, we're dealing with, like, the majority of women that are supposedly going through mental health issues, like women are fucked up and all that, most of them have been abused from young, From young. And their pain has been taken and used in order to push these narratives about ADHD and BPD. I don't even know if I want to identify myself as that anymore, because of how sinister the whole thing is. But that's what I believe is going on. I believe that the pain of abuse victims is being used ultimately to gain a profit, because there's more profit to be gained from people being sick than there is from people being healthy. So why would you do anything about that rapist? Why would you do anything about people that are repeatedly harassing you, especially if they belong to a network that is worth billions? I'm absolutely shocked and disgusted. I'm shocked and disgusted. I'm shocked and disgusted. I have no respect for law enforcement anymore. None. They mean just one thing to me: to get evidence out there, and that's it. They don't mean jack shit to me anymore. Whatever shred of respect I had for law enforcement, that's just gone completely out the window. And whatever hope I had, or whatever redeeming features that these perps around me might have, as far as I'm concerned, they ain't there. If there were any redeeming features about them at all, they wouldn't have been hired, or they would have quit. They wouldn't have been hired in the first place, or they would have quit. Or they would have said, no, I ain't fucking doing it. I always, whenever I get upset or whenever I'm hurt by what the perps have been doing to me, I always try to reason with myself, oh, well, they're working with Nazis anyway. They're working with people who traffic people anyway. They're part of a trafficking ring anyway. It's one thing to tell yourself that, to be a vicious bitch, and it's another thing to be right. So yeah, shout out to Dr. Taylor. She's a stronger woman than me, because I folded in all the decades that I've been through abuse. I've been through abuse, don't get me wrong. I've been essayed. I've been odd, yeah. But the type of shit that I've been through pales in comparison to what this woman's been through. Never that. I ain't never been through some shit like she's been through. And I've been through some really, really bad shit. When we get to torn necks and dislocated shoulders, that's when and as police officers, you still ain't doing nothing. Fuck you. Social services, nothing. You want to diagnose her as mentally ill instead. Fuck all of you. Fuck all of you. Like I said, it's only when you see somebody else going through the same thing as you that it kind of wakes you up. It wakes you up to a lot of things. And now I gotta go. I don't know what else to say. I'm going to continue reading this book. I know it's not going to be an easy read. I just, once again, my respect to Dr. Jessica Taylor. For my fellow TIs, I don't know if I've made any sense. Like, Havana syndrome, so I tend to talk in non sequiturs. I apologize. I can't help it. What the fuck happened, man? Like, the world has always been like this. It just doesn't feel real sometimes. But anyway, I gotta go. Peace and love to all of you. I'm still doing the tarot stuff. I'm still doing the tarot stuff. Got another one coming up on the 16th, so stay tuned for that. Love you. Peace and blessings. Bye-bye.